Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Eric Levine. Eric is an executive vice president at Lindabury, McCormick, Estabrook and Cooper, and serves as co-chair of the firm's Cybersecurity and Data Privacy practice. He works with corporate leaders to create cybersecurity policies and procedures, as well as with internal cyber breach response teams to respond to cyber attacks. Eric advises corporations and their executives on mitigating the impact of cyber breaches and counsels on post-breach regulatory reporting and client-customer notification responsibilities. An accomplished litigator with trial experience in both state and federal courts, he works with corporations to defend claims brought by plaintiffs affected by cyber breaches. Eric is a faculty member in our mini MBA Data-Driven Management and in one of our newest programs, the mini MBA Artificial Intelligence. And with that, Eric, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, Margaret, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're ready for a lunch of ethics and data privacy. Not your ordinary lunch, but today I'm going to speak to you and hopefully with you towards the end of the presentation during the Q&A about things such as data privacy and ethics. How do we handle big data the right way? So before we begin, we need to have an understanding as to what big data and big data analytics are. Many of you may be familiar already with the concepts of big data and big data analytics, either from work or from your studies at Rutgers or just from your experience with technology. But we live truly in an information age, and there is more data out there now than has ever been in the existence of humanity, and it's being used for a number of different purposes, business related and otherwise. So big data essentially deals with the collection of these large data sets and how do we analyze that information. What do we do with big data? What is the goal of using big data? Well, essentially what you want to use that data for is for an understanding of what that data represents. What trends are there? Does it give you any sort of direction, any information about how your customers will respond or how your business should handle certain information? And generally speaking, you're looking for the what to do, where to direct things as opposed to the why. But because the data is so large, traditional methods of analysis don't really work the way they used to. You can't just sit down at a table and look at a spreadsheet and say, okay, I have 10 customers, 8 of them are male, 2 of them are female, therefore maybe I should focus on coming up with things that are more attractive to the male customers, because that's a larger portion of my customer base. The numbers are massive now, so our traditional ways of analyzing data don't really work, and that's where big data analytics come in. So just in looking at a graphic to understand the true magnitude of how data has ballooned in recent years, you can look at this graphic showing the growth of data that's been out there in terms of exabytes, which is a very large measurement of bytes here. And you can take a look right up here and see that it's something like, I think, an exabyte is something like a quadrillion bytes or a larger number. And you can just look at the graphics in the 10 years since 2010, the amount of information that has grown by a multiple of 50%. And you can also see how the information grows in different types of avenues where the information comes in. Sensors and devices, this is going to continue to increase. Social media, enterprise data, not so much. Voice over internet protocols, not so much as well. But what we're seeing is just the evolution of data. It continues to grow nonstop, and we need to have an understanding as how we use that data, how it affects our private lives, and how can we actually use that data in an ethical way. So to continue to have a better understanding, I've tried to include some stats here that will just kind of put it into perspective. According to, Forbes, you can see that at least 1.7 megabytes of new information will be created every second for every human being on the planet. That's just a massive number. I can't even imagine what that is, okay? But it's just information is going to continue to grow. And the next statistic I always found a little bit interesting, or very interesting, I should say, is that it's estimated by Martech Advisors that there'll be over 125 billion Internet of Things devices in the world by 2030, 9 years from now. And this is what I find fascinating. Every owner will own 15 devices. 5G is going to continue to make things even more available. So think about that when you think about the 15 devices. And my first thought was, no one could possibly have 15 devices on their own. But if you think about it, if you have a cell phone, if you have, say, a smartwatch or a wearable, if you have a laptop, if you have an Alexa or some other voice-activated assistant, if you have tablets, you can see very quickly where the 15 devices for each person starts to grow up. The underlying theme that you see here is that it certainly isn't going to go backwards. There's going to be more information and more devices collecting that information as every year goes by. So Forbes also reports that by 2025, over 150 trillion gigabytes of information will need analysis. And that's something that your businesses, your corporations, and even probably in your professional lives, you'll be involved with. Because if that information is out there, there's going to be some sort of usage for it. And IDC also estimates that by 2022, next year, that the spending on data analytics will reach $274.3 billion. So these two facts show you that the information that's out there needs to be dealt with in two ways. Number one, it needs to be analyzed. It needs to be used for something. And number two, there is a tremendous marketplace for data analysis and for figuring out how to use the information that's out there to the benefit of a company. So, when we start to think of how data impacts all of us, it impacts us in our personal lives, and it also impacts us in our business lives. And that impact is going to get even bigger as time goes by. And as a business professional yourself, it's incumbent upon you to have an understanding as to how, from the business standpoint, that data can be utilized to make your company a better company, depending on how you define better, more profitable, more socially conscious, to provide better environments for your employees, things of that nature. But it's how you use that data that will help your company. And be there no mistake, if you're not a company that's doing this sort of data analysis, chances are your competitors will pass you by at some point. So it's important to understand the breadth of the data and how it can be used to affect your corporation, your company. So what industries utilize big data? The short answer is just about every industry that there is, but some of the more prominent ones that we need to think about are the following list. For instance, healthcare. For those who have been paying attention to healthcare, the amount of data that's being used is immense. There are companies out there that track your healthcare usage for things such as diagnostics to figure out trends in healthcare and how to maybe potentially control costs of medication. Data is used in actual diagnosis itself. Right now, there is a growing push towards more radiology being done by programs as opposed to actual individual physicians. Billing information is out there. There's telemedicine, teledocs. We've seen that through the pandemic. So there's tons and tons of information out there in the healthcare world. Banking is almost as big, if not larger. There are so many things that are being done in the banking industry based on information that's out there, such as determining creditworthiness of potential borrowers, doing fraud detection, looking at trends with money coming in and out, seeing how assets are shifted. In the finance world, there's just so much data that's being used in analysis of stock portfolios, stock picking itself, in financial management, in arbitrage. Media, obviously. I mean, everybody has a Netflix account, or you use Hulu or Disney Plus or whatever you use, but the amount of information that's developed there, such as your watching habits, is recorded and people rely upon it. You click on a movie that you watch on Netflix, next time you go to your homepage, you're going to see a recommendation based on your prior selection. That also bleeds over into retail. Amazon is a prime example, and recommendation engines. Nobody who's ever bought anything on Amazon hasn't received any, a recommendation for additional products. Your purchasing habits, how often you spend, what you spend on, that information is being used by retailers all over the world. Energy and utilities, big data is used there to talk about the needs. Where does energy consumption spike? How do we maintain the energy grid in a way that there is enough energy when there needs to be energy? And how do we maximize the conservation when we don't need it? Things like construction. Analytics can be used now to make construction projects more streamlined and efficient by improving time management. And even industries like transportation, just something as simple as traffic control. So pretty much big data is used everywhere. What's the benefit of big data? There are many. One of the biggest things are the efficiencies. If you can improve processes by using refined information, you can get better customer service. You can also tend to lead to increased productivity. If decisions can be made faster, they can be acted upon faster. Product and services can be given to the ultimate consumer quicker. What you end up getting is a greater understanding of the marketplace. And this also helps you as a company to develop new products. How do we do that? We look at information as to what people are buying or are not buying. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, in things like the financial industry, things like fraud detection, faster reaction times. The sooner you can uncover somebody's defrauding someone, the sooner you can stop that fraud, hopefully, and save people money. But there are disadvantages. And there are a lot of disadvantages dealing with big data. Oops, pardon me. One is traditional methods of privacy are often failing, meaning that there's so much information out there, it's becoming much more difficult for the average person to protect their information from disclosure. In fact, things like anonymity are being eroded just as a result of pattern analysis and data analytics. For instance, there was an article years ago about somebody who had determined the identity of a rape victim whose names are anonymous in police records and in court records, but this person was able to determine the identity of a rape victim using predictive analysis and data information, cross-referencing police reports, hospital records, medical records, and things of that nature using an algorithm. They were able to identify who a person who otherwise should have been anonymous. That's problematic. Another disadvantage of big data, the data that's actually being analyzed is subject to human error and quality control. So in other words, is the person who's inputting that data or collecting that data doing it correctly? Have they made sure that everything is accurate? Is the analytical model they build an accurate model? If the model's not, then the results will be skewed. And also, what about information that doesn't necessarily make it into the equation? So there are plenty of things that are good about using big data, plenty of things that can be troubling. So that leads us to our threshold question for the day. Is privacy dead? And if not, how do we keep it alive in a world of big data? And I always like to steal a quote from the Spider-Man movies and basically say, with big data comes big responsibility. Now, everybody may have their own opinion about whether or not the concept of privacy is live or dead. My personal opinion is that we live in a world right now where privacy is severely impacted because of the amount of data that's out there. So we're going to talk about how we address that. And when we do that, we have to look at some guiding principles. And the 4 guiding principles that I'd like us all to consider and keep in mind when we're dealing with data issues and privacy issues when we move forward are the following. Number 1, do we have consent? When we obtain private customer data and even the identity of our private customers, that information should remain confidential unless the customer or the client or the source of that information gives you authorization to use it. If they don't consent, it should not be used. That's simple, basic privacy. What about restrictions? Okay, the information, the use of it should be restricted. It should be considered confidential unless the source of the information tells you can use it otherwise. So 1 and 2 go hand in hand. And what about transparency? Does your customer understand how the data is being used? A good example of this, and I'm one of the annoying people when I go still shop in person, is when you go to the cash register and the person says, okay, can I have your phone number? I ask them why. What is the phone number being used for? You don't need my phone number to take my money, take my credit card, okay? And if they won't give me a good enough answer, I will not give them my phone number. A lot of times you give them your phone number, you end up on a calling list. I don't want that. Be transparent. Tell me what it's going to be used for. And free will. Should the data that we give out be used to steer the customer? Think about Amazon. When we purchase something, we end up getting recommendations automatically built in next time we log in. Those recommendations sometimes steer you towards purchases. Should that happen? Okay. Should an algorithm be allowed to try to direct me towards one thing or another? Something really to consider. So we always have to keep in mind these 4 principles when we're talking about data privacy and, and our ethics. Think of it from the customer standpoint. Are we using the information they're giving us the way that they intended us to use it? And if the answer is no, you need to rethink how you're using the information. So how do ethics fit into this discussion? I like to call ethics society's rules of the road. Okay, it's standards of behavior. How are we supposed to act? The problem is there are different sources of ethics, and people view ethics differently based on your source. And ethics are not the same things as feelings. It's not how you feel. It's not how your religion. Some people argue that some religious beliefs have certain ethical holes in them. Okay, it's certainly not the law. Something could be lawful, but may not be ethical. Okay, and it's not science. They may all factor into your core set of ethics, but ethics are a set of standards that inform you as to how you act. And what do we look for our sources of ethics? It can be anything, okay? It can be fundamentalism. It can be your personal religious beliefs, your spiritual leaders, your book of guidance, like the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, things like that. It can be your sense of fairness. It can be something like utilitarianism. What is best for the common good? What is best for your personal rights? You can see there are different sources of ethics, so everyone views them a little bit differently. But one thing you need to be sure of, ethics do fit into business. Businesses have to have a sense of ethics, in my mind, in order to function properly in society, and those ethics need to be put into place to deal with things like privacy issues. How does your management run its business? Is it in an ethical way, or is it solely about getting a profit? So let's talk about some big data missteps and how things have happened incorrectly in the past. We've seen Facebook with targeted ads that are basically sending certain types of advertisers towards men or women or different ethnical backgrounds, things like that nature. How does Facebook, I should say, get to targeting those ads? Well, they use the information they obtain. The question is, were they open and honest about doing that? We've seen companies like Marriott and Yahoo have data breaches where customer information is basically exposed. Billions of people. Question becomes, did the company consider the importance of that information enough, and did they do enough to protect it? There's an example of the Amazon recruiting tool, which some of you may be familiar with, which was generally an algorithm that turned out to be gender biased. And it was biased against women because the data pool that was used was predominantly a pool in an industry that was dominated by men. The question becomes, was it unethical for Amazon to use that data pool the way they did? They eventually changed it, but it took some time. And one of the biggest ethical missteps I've seen with big data is Equifax. And I'm not just talking about the data breach in 2017, but how Equifax collected information. It was originally just supposed to be a company that helped to determine your creditworthiness. They collected more and more information about purchasing patterns and disposable income well beyond what they needed it for. And then they ended up selling that information. And they bore a huge brunt when the data breach was uncovered, and then people realized what exactly Equifax was doing. So those are just a couple of examples. So we see that big data and big data analytics will always be a challenge to your personal privacy and also to your company, okay, in a way that we haven't had to deal with before, but in a way we're going to have to deal with going forward. And when we say that governmental and corporate databases may contain massive amount of information and have predictive analytics that are more effective than what our friends know about us, I put may in quotes because the short answer is, if those databases don't already have that information, they will. So what do you as a business leader have to be concerned about when you talk about holding large amounts of data? And when we go to the next slides, I want you to think about this from two different perspectives. One from the individual whose information is being held, and one from a business holding the information. So from an individual's perspective, we like to have our information privacy in place because it helps me relax. If you know Big Brother is watching you, you act differently. You're much more tense. You make sure that you do everything, or hopefully you try to make sure you do everything by the book. But that ends up in a much more tense way of living. It's not something you want to do, or I should hope you don't want to do. What about your reputation? Everybody has a persona that they can protect, but everything now is being recorded, is being loaded viral, is being dealt with in social media. Don't we all have a right to be able to protect our reputation? And what about your intellectual life? What if you were going to write the next great novel? It didn't come out that good. Somebody hacks into your computer, gets a copy of it, puts it out on the internet, and all of a sudden people say, wow, Eric Levine's book is terrible. Well, maybe that stifles my intellectual curiosity, and maybe I stop writing books. Does that hurt or help society if our creativity is impacted? And what about intimacy and formality? Okay, think of the Hollywood star who goes on a vacation with their fiance and there's paparazzi, right? But now think about that as on steroids, where everybody's got a cell phone. You know, certain things of your private life are no longer private at all. And what about civility? We've seen this during the past election. We see it now all the time. Too much information sharing sometimes can really hurt some people. I've even seen it on a much more informal scale. And for those of you who have children, imagine if you're the one parent whose child didn't get invited to the birthday party over the weekend, and they start streaming social media photos of the birthday party, and your child goes on somebody's Twitter feed and sees that they weren't invited to that party. Think about what that does to them, okay? It would be perhaps better off if they didn't have that information. So there's a certain sense of human dignity that we're losing some control over when the big data goes out into the universe and everybody can use it. And when we lose that measure of control, I think we lose something of ourselves. But let's look at the flip side, okay? We have privacy limitations here, which actually could hurt us. Big data analytics, with its ability to shift through patterns and data, could potentially help out national security. Imagine if we had data which enabled us to prevent like a 9/11, all right? And shouldn't we be able to do that to prevent the loss of life? Same thing with law enforcement. Shouldn't law enforcement be able to use information out there to break up drug rings, money laundering, things like that, to help uncover crimes? And what about public health? There are tons and tons of medical records out there which could be used to help to diagnose diseases and help to cure them. Shouldn't we do that? The pandemic is a prime example of that. There were positives and there were negatives. Big data was extremely helpful in coming up with vaccines. Not so helpful early on in trying to track the cure, the cause of the pandemic, because there was not a lot of great data early on. And what about business efficiency and profits? Doesn't it help every business to be able to use data to become more efficient, to give to the purchaser, the buyers, what they want at a cost they want? So you start to see that there has to be a balance between human privacy and the potential benefits of data analysis and using such large pieces of information. And this, by the way, is where the struggle will continue to be. So what are data ethics? If ethics are the standards of behavior, how do we apply that to data? Well, we have to look at five core pieces of, five core concepts, I think, to determine what we think is right and wrong conduct in dealing with vast amounts of personal information. First one is ownership. Who owns the data? Is it the individual or is it somebody else? A prime example there is when you go to your doctor's office. When you give your doctor, when you take a physical, the outcome of that physical should be owned by you because it's your physical, but is it not in some way also owned by the doctor who needs that information in order to provide a service for you? So who owns it? Is ownership exclusive or not? Again, transparency. What is the information I'm giving you for going to be used for? So if I give you certain information, tell me, what is it going to be used for? How long is it going to be stored? Consent. Do we just assume that somebody gives you their information, they've consented to it? Or do we make it something more explicit? And can that consent be pulled back? Oops, sorry. Privacy, we always have to keep in mind. And also understanding currency, and this is big. What is information worth? We've seen this recently, examples of what information is worth in terms of currency. If you think about things like the Colonial Pipeline hack, and when people are hitting other entities with ransomware, there is a value to all of your information, okay? So we need to have an understanding of those five concepts when we're talking about dealing with data. So what do? How do we establish confidentiality? Well, we can take a couple of hints from or tips from the GDPR in Europe. We can have terms and conditions on all of our devices. We can make them opt-in versus opt-out, meaning as opposed to you opting out by checking a box, you automatically are opted out and you have to check a box for the other side to use your information. Do we really have a genuine choice whether to accept the terms and conditions on a program? We all do it. We all don't read the programs, the terms and conditions. We scroll down and we just click on accept. Maybe the companies need to do a better job of making sure we understand that and setting it up so that we actually have to make an affirmative choice to let them use our information, and it's not just automatic. Excuse me. We also have to keep in mind that the information that we use can have an impact on the people we will become, or the people that our customers or clients hope they will become, excuse me. And this goes in the form of algorithms, okay? What happens is we take that information, we distill it down, and then we say, how can I use this to market my business? And we realize then in some ways when we do that and we apply the algorithms to the people who are buying our products or our services, we're trying to prompt them to act in a different way. We have to understand how that works. We have to understand the impact on people. And by taking recognition of that, sometimes we might want to view the perspective of our customer as opposed to a business person. Do I really want this person to get 37 unsolicited emails trying to force them or to subtly maneuver them into buying my product? Is that too much? The law as it applies to ethics in data is a little bit nebulous. There right now is no one single federal law that deals with it, but the FTC has moved in to try to keep control over data privacy by saying that it's essentially a consumer deceptive practice, if you take the data and the information of a customer and you use it in an improper way. So the government is trying to address this, but the United States government is not as much a regulator as it is. It's letting the free market do a lot more than perhaps, like, say, the European Union. But this has to become a C-suite and a board level issue. Companies have an ethical obligation, in my opinion, to recognize that they contain private information of both their employees and their customers, and they have to deal with it properly. For instance, just protecting their information from being breached, a company has to have an information security plan. And this has to be something dealt with at the board of directors, top-down management. If the board of directors doesn't set the tone and say, we want to protect the information of our clients, we want to make sure that we're transparent, that we have their consent, that we're doing what we can to protect that information, then senior management and rank and file won't be able to adopt practices that will do so. And this isn't just a one-time issue. This has to be a constant board issue that's dealt with at every single board meeting. It's got to become a staple of the company that you run or that you operate in. There are other laws that are out there which have helped us to try to deal with some of these issues. There are federal privacy laws that deal with healthcare, like HIPAA. There are privacy issues built into Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which deals with financial institutions. If you deal with minors, children under the age of 13, you're governed by COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. There are plenty of other laws that are out there, okay? But you can't just rely on the law to help you govern the control of the information. You have to make it part of your practice. There are also state laws that are out there. And what's interesting is to see how these laws are developing. States to watch are California, which has the California Consumer Privacy Act, and New York. New York has just enacted the Tenant Data Privacy Act, which is pretty interesting. Now it says landlords, if you collect private information from your tenants, you have to give them certain notices. There's also the Illinois Biometric Information Protection Act, a leading piece of legislation that deals with facial recognition. New Jersey has its own law, the Identity Theft Protection Act. And I won't get into the specifics of it, just to let you know there's a law that's out there, and you can use that as a tool to help guide you. But the law is not the end all and be all of data ethics. Europe gives us a good example. The GDPR went into effect in May of 2018, and it applies to any company doing business with citizens of the European Union. This could apply to your company, by the way, especially if you have a global presence and you do things online. And it basically provides with very strict rules and regulations about how the information of customers can be used and how it has to be stored. And if you violate the GDPR, the penalties are extreme. You can be penalized up to 4% of your company's global annual revenue. So the question becomes, is this a harbinger of things to come, or is it a bad thing? I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's going to cost companies more money, and it will make your processes a little bit more involved. But at the end of the day, it will protect you by protecting the information that you have in your possession. So what's the harm? Well, if somebody steals my information, but they don't necessarily steal my identity, they don't cause me to actually physically lose money, have I been harmed? The Supreme Court says yes. In the decision called Spokio versus Robbins, although there's been a split between certain of the districts here. But basically what the courts are saying is, if your information has been exposed and it's possible that it could be utilized by the general public without your approval, that's injury. Think about it to somebody seeking a job. My personal information gets out. Nobody loses, I don't lose any money, nobody steals any of my funds, but a prospective employer does a Google search of me and finds private information about me. I send in a resume, I don't get an interview. That could have a serious and significant impact on my future. I could lose a job because information gets out there. What's the cost to businesses? Okay, this is really something which can be a business killer. How you use your data can be a death knell for your company. Think about Equifax, right? Think about the reputational harm that hits a company when it finds out that you didn't safeguard your information. Think about the Target data breach of 2018, how much that hurt Target, okay? Think about what happens when your company is a victim of ransomware. And when your information is locked up, or worse, the ransomware attacker takes the information you have and publishes it on the internet, and it turns out you didn't do a good enough job of protecting the information that you had in your hands. So it becomes very important to understand that protecting information and being sure that you use the information correctly and you safeguard it can keep your business from going under. So what can you do? I'm just trying to keep a track of time here. This is probably the most important slide of the entire presentation. From a business perspective, you need to understand what information you have and why. And this is not necessarily as easy as you think. For instance, if you have a website and if you take orders or inquiries from customers around the world, you may be gathering information about the location of your customers about their finances, about their payment card methods that you didn't even realize. And you may be subjecting yourself to exposure. If you take an order from somebody who is a citizen of the European Union, you're now subject to the GDPR. Why do you have the information and why do you need it? So if you ask somebody who's buying a widget to put in information and you ask for the prefix of their name, Mr. or Mrs., I don't know if you necessarily need that, but in doing so, you now have information about the gender of the person buying. It's not anonymized. Who has access to that information? Who in your company has access to that information? And is there a reason why they should? It's called the principle of least privilege. Some information can be walled off from other people in the company who don't need it. For instance, somebody who is just simply filling a shipping order doesn't necessarily need to know the name of the person for the order going to. They put the information in the box, move it down the line. Somebody else deals with the address information and deals with shipping. You also need to check your infrastructure early and often. What do I mean by this? Where do you store your data? Are you storing things in the cloud? Is this being done on servers? Where is all that information? And is it secure? Now, the truth is, it's almost impossible to 100% secure anything if it's attached to the internet. So maybe you take some information away from the internet. You take servers offline. You need to constantly train your people. Everybody needs to know what information they're dealing with, why it needs to be protected, and how to protect that information. And this is something as simple as maybe certain information isn't just simply sent online in a PDF. Things may need to be encrypted. You need to make sure you understand how you communicate with your employees. Are we communicating by email or do we not? Prevent, email spam and phishing attempts from happening by training people and employees on that. You also need to ensure this risk. If you run a company, you need to make sure that you have cyber insurance policies, if for no other reason than to deal with something like ransomware, but also to protect from other potential risks that could come about. And you need to plan for the inevitable, because in this data age, it is inevitable that just about every single company will get hacked and will be subject to some sort of data leak. You may not even know it yet. One thing that people in my practice area talk about is there are two types of companies: those that have been hacked and those that don't know that they've been hacked. So I moved rather quickly, and I apologize, but I'm, in a lunch and learn, there's a lot to talk about with data ethics and a lot to talk about with data privacy. And before I have Margaret start to go into the Q&A and the chat, I just want to, reiterate what I was saying earlier. The overriding principle that we want to talk about is that if you recognize at least the vast amount of data that is being utilized by your company, and you understand what that data is being used for, while at the same time recognizing that the person who's provided you with that information has certain privacy rights that need to be counterbalanced with the business aspects, it puts you in a better place just by asking that question. Because once you understand that there are data issues or privacy issues with the data, you can take a look at and ask yourself, am I really using this information correctly? Is my business profiting, but at the same time, is the person who gave me that information also feeling protected? And am I making sure that while I'm maximizing my business's operations, I'm not unnecessarily exposing the risk of the person who gave me that information? Because the truth of the matter is if the information is used improperly or isn't secured, the person who gave it to you will be harmed, and then they will ultimately look at your business to seek recompense for that harm. And in dealing with liability and dealing with lawsuits and dealing with loss of business reputation, that costs your business as well. So just understanding that this ethical balance is always going to be out there, as long as there's going to be information free floating out on the internet, and recognizing that you have to take steps to acknowledge that and to protect it, you should get a pretty good start. And that being said, Margaret, it's 12:42, but if we want to start to go to the Q&A, so that way we can give everybody some time.
Absolutely. Eric, thank you so much for a fantastic and yet equally terrifying presentation. Um,
I was
I,
going for that, by the way. There needs to be a little bit of fear in here, because the simple fact remains is that if you don't take the threat of the misuse of this data seriously, it's very easy just to get lost in it and say, I've got all this information, company's doing great, haven't been hurt yet, I'll worry about it when it happens. Can't be that way. There has to be a little bit of a sense of edge.
no, and I was laughing when you said that you are that person who confronts, the store clerks and different people who ask you for information like your phone number. And I have done exactly the same, except I always refuse no matter what their answer is. And I've actually had to have like managers come out and so forth. So yeah, definitely a big deal for me too. So
No one
um,
ever has a good answer for that either. They
yeah,
don't.
exactly. There's no justification of violating my privacy. So
What's even more so, and I apologize, one last note and something for everyone to think about. Think about how many times you're asked for your social security number, including when you do things like financial transactions. That was never the purpose of social security numbers. It was never meant to be used as part of any financial transactions. It has now become part of it, and we may be too far away to remove it. But there are certainly times when you do not need to give somebody your social security number at all. I mean, now when you get that, we've used it as almost a universal identifier. Your social security number gets out, you will be the subject of identity theft. No doubt about it. No doubt about it at all. So think twice before doing something like that. Somebody asks you for your social security number, even when you go for a loan or something like that. It doesn't hurt to ask the question, why do you need that information and what are you going to do with it? Okay. So questions.
all right. So audience question. Do you foresee an all-encompassing US law at the federal level the way that the GDPR was created? Because individual states might kind of create a chaotic environment in a digital marketplace.
I do, except for the fact that unfortunately our Congress is not, these past, I don't know, 12 years, been able to get there. I think we have to have a federal law at some point. The GDPR is a prime example of how it can work. The problem that you have with a mishmash of multiple state laws is there's inconsistency. And for instance, in breach notification, and this is something that a business needs to understand. If you have customers in more than one state and you have a data breach, you will be subject to the laws of every state in which you have customers. And if there are 50 different data breach laws, you may have to have 50 different types of notification. Imagine that for a small company. Prime example, data breaches in California. They need to be responded to within a very short period of time. I believe maybe even 72 hours. In New Jersey, you do not respond until you get clearance from the state police. You see the problem. If you do business with customers in California and New Jersey, and you're a New Jersey company, and you have a data breach on a Friday afternoon, you'll have to respond to your California customers by Monday, not your New Jersey customers. It's tremendously burdensome. And I had to deal with that a couple of years ago when I spoke with a client and they had a data breach. And I said, how many customers do you have? Oh, we only have about 400 or 500. Not too bad. How many states are they in? Well, mostly in New Jersey. I said, well, mostly, where are the others? California. I said, stop, red flag already. We've got a problem. We have the clock is running. So I do foresee one law coming in and governing. The question is when, but I think it's probably going to track the GDPR in certain regards.
Yes, this is a very intimidating environment to be a business in.
It is.
I often look at these myself from more of the personal side of it, protecting my personal information, but being the business who is so proud of their nationwide expansion to have to deal with this is a lot. So All right, we have another question that just came in. So we hear over and over again that data-informed technologies like AI are biased because they are based on already biased systems, and the conversation seems to end there. What is your perspective on the ethical responsibility of working to end inequities in a system in conjunction with the development and use of AI within that system?
I think that's a great question. And for the author of that question, if you haven't already signed up for the version of the Data Privacy AI Intelligence program that Margaret and I are involved with, you should sign up. But bias is a problem. I think what needs to be done on the corporate side is understanding where bias comes from and how to deal with it. It's not always just intrinsically the bias of the person creating the AI system, the data programmer. It could be bias in the information itself. Looking at the data pools, the example I used before, the Amazon recruiting tool, the data pool was a biased pool. Even though the program scrubbed everything about gender, the problem was it was a self-learning program, and the historical data it learned from came from a period of time when the only people who were really being hired in the Silicon Valley era were men. So there was intrinsically bias there. The other problem with bias is we have to determine a way, if we are going to rely on artificial intelligence, to constantly revisit the machine learning programs and the AI programs that are developing to see if we can open up the black box and investigate if there is any more bias. In other words, does the program itself, by virtue of its learning, potentially adopt a bias that wasn't intended? So again, the design could be perfectly fine. The data set could be flawed. So I think that you're right. The conversation can't just stop with there's bias. It's okay. How do we correct it out front? How do we revisit it as the program develops? And how do we modify the programming to adopt the bias? It is possible, at least in some programs, and the Amazon tool, again, is an example. They eventually scrubbed the program after they tried to adapt their algorithm. And when they did adapt it, the numbers did change. But they ultimately determined that the entire program, the tool itself, was too inherently biased. So they just figured it was easier to just do away with it.
Fascinating. So just a reminder to our audience so they can go to the Q&A. We do have a few more minutes left that we can address some additional questions. Type your question in there. Eric, one question that I was going to ask you about was driver's license and how often people are asked to provide that, and how often it leaves your hand and is scanned into some, medical office or hotel or whatever. So what's your perspective on protecting that in the same way that you talked about protecting your social security number?
Well, I think, again, your driver's license number is a critical piece of information because it gives away a whole bunch of information, assuming somebody can gain access to that database. It gives people your address, your date of birth, your gender. It's also tied to a vehicle. Based on the nature of the vehicle, it could be an indication of your socioeconomic status. So it's a piece of information which I would not give out unless absolutely necessary to do so. And if I really want to break down and let's think about who should you give your driver's license to other than to DMV, maybe your motor vehicle insurance company, and the police officer is giving you a ticket. Who else needs it? For what purpose? I would not give out that sort of information. And if somebody asked me for it, I would want to know why and what they're doing. And if somebody is giving you that information, by the way, to use it, I guess, to verify your identification, then I would want to know what they're doing to protect that information and to dispose of it when they're done. So for instance, when you go to a loan closing and you need to show identity to the bank as a borrower, we have government issued driver's licenses. That's pretty much the accepted photo ID. The bank will generally take a photocopy of it and keep it for their records. You won't get your loan unless you give them that information. But it might be worth a question to say to the bank next time you go there, okay, how are you going to make sure that that information never gets disseminated onto the internet? And they may give you a look and say, what do you mean? Well, In the old days, if you put in a file cabinet, after say 7 years, you could take it out and shred it. Now, if you digitize it, what steps have you taken to ensure that those records are secure from hacking? Is it going to be encrypted? How long are you going to keep it for? You might not like the answer, but at least asking the questions will give you a little bit more insight. The good news is that at least when you use driver's licenses for things like that, under Gramm-Leach-Bliley and some of the other laws that are out there, the banking industry is getting better with protecting information. They're still not perfect though. So again, it's the type of information I wouldn't give out easily. And again, other than to DMV, to maybe a lender if you're getting a loan just for purposes of identification, or police officer pulling you over for car insurance, I wouldn't give that information out.
All right, and I think one of the last questions we'll take for today is about one of the newest challenges, which is that people want to be able to prove that someone coming into their establishment has been vaccinated. So what about those vaccine cards and vaccine passports, I think they're calling them, and all things related to COVID?
Well, there's a couple of concerns with that. Number one, not the least of which is the COVID vaccine cards can easily be manipulated. I mean, there's like a standard form, but it's not in digital form, it's in paper form. I have mine, I keep it in my wallet in case anyone asks for it. But if you're looking at it from the personal perspective, whether or not you should have to give somebody documentary proof of your vaccination is a tough question, because some people may have a religious objection towards getting a vaccine. There could be other reasons for it. Full disclosure, I got my vaccine. I don't have a problem with it. I don't mind telling people that I have my vaccine. But if you're looking at it from the business perspective, what are you going to do with that information? And why do you need to see the vaccine card? And if you actually, for some reason, were to take a copy of that card, are you now not exposing yourself to potential liability because you are in possession of protected health information, which is governed by HIPAA? And there's a whole statutory scheme that's put in place there. So let's say I have customers come in and they just have to show me their vaccine card, but I forgot that I have closed circuit cameras that manage everything. So now you think that, oh, they're just showing me the card, I've got no record of it, but now I've got a closed circuit film of that record. And what if my closed circuit feed gets hacked, and now somebody can take a look at Jane Doe's vaccine card and can say they got the Moderna virus at this pharmacy on this date. Now, I don't know what that information is useful for, but me as a business owner, have I just now allowed the disclosure of private health information? It's possible. And then I could be exposed to HIPAA, and I could be exposed to statutory penalties under HIPAA. So we start to see very quickly how something as innocuous, and not trying to coin a phrase there, a thing like getting proof of vaccination can very quickly turn into a data privacy issue. So you have to think from a business standpoint, do I need to see that? What's my purpose of seeing that information? How am I going to use it? And if I'm going to somehow store that information, I better be extra careful in doing so. And again, hopefully just asking the question will inform your conduct. Like, for instance, do I really need to see their vaccination card? I don't know. Maybe I can still just put up a mask mandate. There's nothing wrong with that. And if a person doesn't want to come in without wearing a mask, they don't come in. You don't have a privacy issue there. No real concern. It's tough though. COVID has made privacy issues a lot more difficult to deal with.
Wow, I had not even considered those surveillance cameras in all of these, because that applies to everything that you said, showing your license as an ID, showing a vaccination card, all of that. Oh my goodness. I don't think any of us are going to sleep tonight, Eric. Not one of us.
It's scary and it may be extreme, but think about it. There are very few places that you can go in public where there is not a camera somewhere. And that camera is presumably attached to a feed, and that feed records information. So When you go to a liquor store and you go and you hand somebody at the liquor store your credit card information and you look over their shoulder and you see the camera, it's possible that that camera could see what you're buying, your bottle of Jack Daniels or whatever, could see your Visa with your number, right? And embedded in that feed is time and date. So a lot of information right there that people could access. Now, again, it's not all Big Brother. It's not that everyone is going to be looking at that information, but it's certainly possible. And the more information that's out there and the more information that's created by going digital, right, the more it could be, you could be exposed. Think about it one more way to frighten everyone a little bit. Use Apple Pay. You go to the supermarket. You make a connection, a wireless connection between your phone and the supermarket's point of service payment device. In that brief second, you're transmitting information about what's on your phone, payment information. Theoretically, you're getting a simultaneous feedback confirming, which probably has embedded in the information about your purchases. Tremendous amount of information right there. Okay. So what is the supermarket doing to protect that information? What's your iPhone doing to protect your Apple Pay? They can be real scary questions. They
Oh
can.
my. So, Eric, despite all of the fear that you've instilled, I do want to thank you so much for your time. And it
You're
really
welcome.
was a fantastic and informative presentation about big data governance, ethics, and privacy. For our audience members who are interested in learning more from Eric, he is a faculty member in 2 of our mini MBA programs, the one on data-driven management and the one on artificial intelligence. And more information is available in the executive education section of the Rutgers Business School website about those. Our audience created a great environment and enhanced our event with their enthusiastic participation in Q&A today. So I want to thank them. And provide a friendly reminder to everyone listening that the RBS Virtual Lunch and Learn series takes place on Wednesdays at noon Eastern Time. For 2021, we're aiming for the 3rd Wednesday each month. For more information, you can always visit our webpage. I say it out loud so people who are hearing the recording can have it, but anyone who has registered will get reminders about our forthcoming webinars. It's business.rutgers.edu/alumni/lifelong-learning. We have an exciting schedule of topics and presenters lined up over the next several months, and that's thanks to great suggestions from our audience. We encourage you to keep sharing your ideas with us so this series continues to meet your needs. And we kindly ask that you stay online for just a moment longer when today's webinar closes, because you'll see a very brief survey about today's event. One question provides a free-form field for you to type in topics and/or speakers you'd like to see featured in our future webinars. And finally, as I mentioned when our webinar began, a link to the archived recording of this presentation will be shared via social media and email to all of those who registered. It will also appear on the Business Insights page of our website. So on behalf of Dean Lay's Lifelong Learning Team, I'm Margaret O'Donnell, and I'd like to thank our presenter and our audience for making today's webinar a great one and wish you a fabulous rest of the day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.